Chapter 9. Even after Lord Henry's departure, Prudence didn't speak. Ernest liked how quietly she sat. It was unusual in a woman. The crease between her brows seemed to indicate that she was puzzled. He agreed that there was much about the meeting to puzzle, even without the strange storm heading toward them. Ernest finally broke the silence, most unusual. Yes? Ernest waited for her to say more, and when she didn't, he shifted to look at her, only just realizing how close they sat on the uncomfortable couch. Her scent, something light and as unexpected as she was, came to him, for once the reminder that she was a woman not causing him pain. He didn't try to discern why. The situation had pulled him out of the past, out of pain, out of everything familiar. Into the unknown. Into the impossible. He found he didn't mind as much as he should. You didn't trust him? The question surprised him. He had not realized he felt distrust until he asked it. No. She looked at him, her face close enough that he could see all the colors in her eyes. And the curve of her lips. Did you? The question pursed her lips just right for. He looked away. He shook his head. No. He frowned. I'm not sure why. He looked at her once more. He's creepy, she pointed out. She sighed. That doesn't make him the bad guy. Bad guy? He shook his head. The villain of the piece. Oh. Ernest looked at the door where Lord Henry had left. He would be excellent on the stage. He frowned as something in his gut twitched. A sense that he'd said something that mattered. Do you think he was acting? The direct question startled him. I'm not good. Do you think he was acting? She persisted, leaning in so that he couldn't look away. He frowned. I'm not sure that was, no, not acting so much as he doesn't seem authentic. He rubbed his aching head with frustration. That's not right, he was too. Was he? She hesitated long enough he had to look at her, too real? He considered this, then nodded slowly. Yes. He studied this notion and felt the correctness of it. How strange. Can one be too real? One was either real or one was not. Or so he'd always believed. He could concede that his notion of reality had been tested in the last few hours. She tipped her head to one side and seemed to seriously consider the question. Then she made a face. Before today I'd have said no, but today we're working on believing impossible things. Impossible things. It was the first indication that she experienced difficulty with them too. How many had he been forced to deal with so far? He rubbed his forehead. It is stuffy in here. He was used to fresher breezes, airship life. This place felt closed in, confining. His thinking processes felt as clouded and confined. I need to walk. To pace is what he meant. How many miles had he logged, pacing the perimeter of his airship? Let's go for a walk. With the beacon lit, it's clear enough out there, though we better stick to the boardwalks. She sighed. Pacing sometimes helps with thinking. She appeared indifferent to the proprieties. Technically they were not alone in this cottage, since the automatons were close by. Her confidence in his integrity both pleased and puzzled. It implied, once again, equality between them. Not assumed either. Expected was closer to what he sensed from her. She didn't speak again, not until they strolling along the boardwalk toward the lighthouse. The tide was still out. In the diffuse light from overhead, he could see the high water lines on the rocks. He dimly perceived the hull of his airship, almost motionless in the unusually still air. The pier jutted out from the other boardwalk, the one from the lighthouse. It looked to be sturdy, as was his ship, but if the storm turned severe, he wished he could move it. He frowned. He could have his ship handlers take it into mobile, but if the storm moved inland, they did not have the programming to react suitably to the threat. You're concerned about the weather, man. Did she read minds? He nodded. I am concerned about all of us, she admitted with a sigh. I wish we had time for a tour. It looks to be a fine ship. He opened his mouth to offer but closed it again. In the dark, no, that was taking proprieties too far. He realized she was the first woman he didn't mind boarding his airship. Because he didn't feel guilt, he looked up, anxious to change the subject. The glow from the lighthouse beacon was different from moon or starlight. The light was softer. Brighter, then softer as the Fresnel lens turned in its unique pattern so that ships would know which lighthouse this was. He studied it, interested to note that it created a sort of umbrella of light overhead, the effect quite interesting. He'd only ever seen a beacon from out over the ocean, he realized. The change in perspective was intriguing. That thought made his instincts twitch. Or flinch. His perspective of many things was currently being challenged. A change of perspective was also the reason he'd left, or so he'd told himself. How much had it actually changed, he wondered now. I've become quite fascinated with lighthouses, she murmured, her gaze also directed upwards. They are beautiful and hopeful. Hope. He'd been hopeful once. Felt it stirring inside now. In this light, with her chin raised like that, she was quite beautiful. For the first time in 4 years, he felt no guilt at admiring another woman. She was so different, it was impossible to compare, he told himself. She turned, her chin lowering as her gaze met his, and he had the most extraordinary feeling that he'd been here, in this moment, with her, before. He swayed as the horizon tilted, and she grabbed his arm to steady him. Are you all right, doctor? He covered her hand with his, and with the horizon in a slow spin around them said, You called me Ernest before. The pause was long, but she didn't look away or appear startled or any of the things she should have. Instead, she looked intrigued. Did I? But he rubbed his head. How can I have this memory when I know this is the first time we have met? Or met here, I have certainly never been here before. She steered them toward a spot where a mass of granite offered seating. He sank down, needing the respite for knees that did not feel like his own. Your memory is specific to this place? She asked. He examined it, and finally nodded. Yes, though it makes my head hurt thinking of it. He looked at her. How can that be? That would be another impossible thing, she said ruefully. I call them the impossible possible, since they clearly happened. You don't remember? She shifted a bit, her mouth pursing for almost a minute. I don't remember, no, not yet anyway. Time is, well, fluid. That makes us uncomfortable, so we call it déjà vu or past lives or, she grinned, a knock on the head. It's only if we open ourselves up to the impossible that we begin to accept more and be surprised less. He stared at her, not wanting to believe, his mind whirled, but his heart said he knew this woman. Against logic and science. Knew her, and, as if in a dream, he lifted his hand and touched the side of her face. She didn't flinch or move back. Just watched him with curiosity in her gaze, but something more. He looked deep and found cautious hope in the brown depths. Hope. It was quite contagious tonight. He thought he'd discovered all the colors in her eyes, but he found more in the beacon light. Golds. Greens. Dark and light. So much more light than dark. In some strange fashion he felt she saw him, all the parts of who he was, even those he was less enamored of, and still liked him despite. His hand slid along her cheek, then around to the back of her neck. Her skin was softer than the finest silk, the stroke of her hair to the back of his hand sending light into his long darkened, hopeless heart. Hope. He didn't think. Instead, he bent toward her, noting that her head tipped to accommodate his approach, angling just enough so that they came together. It felt not new, but as if it had always been like this between them. It felt more natural than he'd ever felt with Ophelia. The rightness of holding her, of kissing her, shocked him. He pulled her closer, diving deeper into the kiss he demanded, and she did not seem to mind. There was the sound of wood against wood, as if something had hit the pier. He jerked back, waited for the guilt, but it stayed at bay. His hands lingered on her shoulders. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her eyes big enough to fall into again. A wave hit his legs, drenching him to his knees. She looked down, so he did too. "The tide is coming in," he said. She frowned, shook her head. "It's not time for the tide. And it shouldn't reach us up here in any case." "Then what?" "Could be storm surge." "Must be." "Storm surge? Do you refer to storm tide?" Before she could answer, they heard footsteps thumping on wood. The sound changed some when it moved to the boardwalk. Now they felt the vibration of the steps on the wood under their feet. "Sir." Ernest huffed out a sigh and let his hands fall away from her. "That's Niles. One of my ship handlers." "Niles?" Her lips curved a bit, as if something about the name amused her. The boardwalk shuddered. Like it had been waiting for his attention, the wind freshened. Only instead of the scent of the sea, it carried the brimstone smell and taste he recalled from the storm. She rose to her feet and turned to face the gulf, her chin lifting toward the dark horizon. "I think your storm is almost here." "That's not," he stopped. He would have to come up with a new definition of possible, it seemed. The automaton came into the light cast by the lighthouse beacon. One moment all was quiet and then, he blinked. "And then it wasn't, sir." "Crispin?" Ernest asked. He was below deck. "Is the weatherman all right?" "It was intact when I left it, but..." The automaton stopped, lacking the programming to explain what had happened, Ernest surmised. "The water is rising fast," Prudence said. She glanced back toward the cottage. The glow from the cottage windows somehow appeared further away than logic said they could be. Ernest studied the horizon again. His impulse to send Niles back in for his counterpart died. Outside the beacon cast light all was deeply, ominously dark. "It almost appears that," he stopped, unable to say the words. "Like the beacon is keeping it back," she finished for him. "That wasn't on my impossible list." She sighed. "If it is holding it back, we'd better make sure it stays lit until..." He looked at her. "Until?" "We come up with a plan." It was, he realized, possible to admire a person's optimism and be astonished by their apparent insanity. One did not plan for this. One fled storms. If one could not, then one rode them out hoping, praying to survive. And then one dealt with what came after. The guilt, the pain tried to come back, but there was not the time for either. That would also have to wait for after. You've been listening to Specters in the Storm by Pauline Baird Jones. Copyright by Pauline Baird Jones. All rights reserved.